On a tiny island off the coast of what we now call England, monks were preparing for morning prayers. They had no idea that within hours, their world would end, that they were about to witness the beginning of an age of blood, conquest, and transformation that would reshape Britain forever. This is the story of the Vikings in Britain. What was so terrifying about this moment that it changed history forever? Lindisfarne, the Holy Island. For 200 years, this tiny monastery off the coast of Northumbria had been one of the jewels of Christendom. The Lindisfarne Gospels, works of breathtaking beauty, were created here. Kings were buried here. Saints walked these stones. The monks believed they were untouchable, protected by the sea, protected by their holiness, protected by God Himself. They were wrong. The raiders who burst through those doors showed no mercy, no hesitation, no fear of divine retribution. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the historical record of England, describes what happened next in words dripping with shock and disbelief, as if reading ancient text. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. But who were these terrifying raiders, and why did they come? To understand what happened at Lindisfarne, we need to travel backward in time, to the cold fjords of Scandinavia, to a world most people in medieval Europe knew nothing about. We need to understand the Vikings. Everything you think you know about Vikings is probably wrong. Let me show you who they really were. This is where they came from: Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the lands we collectively call Scandinavia. But here's the first thing you need to know. They didn't call themselves Vikings. To the people who lived in Scandinavia during this period, they were Norse, or Danes, or Swedes. Viking wasn't an identity, it was an activity. The word Viking, spelled V-I-K-I-N-G, is actually a verb in Old Norse. It means to go raiding, or to go on an expedition. You didn't a Viking, you went Viking. Because most Scandinavians during the Viking Age weren't raiders at all. They were farmers. They lived in small communities scattered across some of the harshest landscapes in Europe. They grew barley and oats. They raised cattle, sheep, pigs. They fished. They hunted. They survived. The vast majority of Norse people during the Viking Age never went on a single raid, never left their home valley, never saw the ocean. The popular image of Vikings as these brutal, mindless barbarians who just wanted to kill and destroy, it's completely wrong. Most Scandinavians in this period were peaceful farmers trying to make a living in an extremely marginal environment. The climate in Scandinavia was harsh. The growing season was short. You had maybe 4 months to plant, grow, and harvest everything you needed to survive the winter. It was hard work, constant work. For those who did go raiding, and it was a minority, it was seasonal. You'd go Viking in the summer when the weather was good and the seas were calm. Then you'd come home for the harvest. It was dangerous, but potentially very profitable. Think of it like extremely risky seasonal employment. So, if they were farmers, what made some of them become raiders? 3 things: climate, technology, and opportunity. Let's start with climate. In the late 700s AD, Scandinavia experienced a warming period. Temperatures rose by just a degree or two, but in these marginal agricultural zones, that made an enormous difference. Warmer weather meant longer growing seasons. Longer growing seasons meant better harvests. Better harvests meant more food. More food meant population growth. and population growth in a land with limited farmland created a problem. In Norse society, land was typically inherited by the eldest son. Younger sons, they had to find their own way, their own fortune. And many of them looked outward, across the sea, to lands rumored to be rich, undefended, ripe for the taking. But looking outward wasn't enough. They needed a way to get there. Impressed, building, emotion, wonder. And this is where Viking technology becomes absolutely crucial. The Viking longship was perhaps the most advanced piece of maritime engineering in medieval Europe, possibly in the entire medieval world. These ships were fast, flexible, incredibly versatile. They could cross open ocean in rough weather. They could navigate shallow rivers barely 3 feet deep. They could be beached and launched with minimal crew. With a longship, Vikings could appear anywhere, at any time, without warning. They could strike and vanish before anyone could respond. It was the medieval equivalent of having stealth bombers when everyone else is still fighting with swords. The longship gave Vikings access to places no one else could reach. Think about it. Most medieval ships couldn't navigate shallow coastal waters. They needed deep harbors. Viking ships could sail right up rivers into the heart of a kingdom. And the speed! These ships could cover 60, 70 miles in a day under good conditions. In an era when most people never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace, that was incredible mobility. So, climate change created population pressure. Ship technology provided mobility. But there was one more ingredient necessary for the Viking Age to begin: opportunity. And when Vikings looked across the North Sea at Britain and Ireland, they saw opportunity everywhere. Like monasteries, isolated, undefended, literally sitting on islands with no fortifications, filled with gold, silver, jewels, and precious manuscripts. Trading centers, coastal villages, estates, all vulnerable, all accessible by sea, and no professional armies to stop them. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were more interested in fighting each other than defending their coasts. In 793, all three factors came together: climate pressure, ship technology, and targets that were rich, isolated, and defenseless. The result was Lindisfarne. Remember those monks who thought they were protected? And Lindisfarne was just the beginning. The Lindisfarne raid was just the spark. What came next was a firestorm that would engulf Britain for decades. 794. The monastery at Jarrow. Attacked. Plundered. 795. The monastery on the island of Iona in Scotland. One of the most sacred sites in Celtic Christianity. Raided. That same year, Recrew in Ireland. Attacked. 796. 797. 798. Every summer, more raids, more destruction, more terror. Monasteries, trading posts, coastal villages, anywhere with portable wealth, anywhere accessible by sea, anywhere that couldn't mount effective resistance. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent. Vikings would appear without warning, strike, grab everything valuable they could carry, and vanish before any response could be organized. What you have to understand is that for the English, this was absolutely unprecedented. Monasteries were supposed to be inviolable. They were sacred spaces under divine protection. The idea that someone would deliberately attack a monastery, not for some political or military reason, but purely for profit. It was shocking, incomprehensible. It broke all the rules of warfare as they understood them. And the Vikings didn't care. They didn't share Christian beliefs about sacred spaces. They saw treasure, they took it. It was that simple. Archaeologically, we can track the evolution of these early raids. In the beginning, late 700s, early 800s, they're hit-and-run operations, small groups, quick raids, grab and go. But by the 830s and 840s, something changes. We start finding evidence of Viking raiders, overwintering, setting up camps, sometimes fortified camps. This isn't seasonal raiding anymore. This is the beginning of occupation. The English tried to adapt. Some monasteries moved inland, others built walls, though walls were of limited use against raiders who attacked by surprise and left before reinforcements arrived. Some buried their treasures. Archaeological digs still turn up hoards of silver and gold buried during this period, wealth hidden from Viking raiders and never recovered because the people who buried it were killed or enslaved. And some kingdoms tried something else. They tried to pay the Vikings to go away. It was called Danegold, Danish gold, protection money, tribute. Call it what you want, it was paying raiders to leave you alone. In the short term, it worked. Vikings would take the silver and leave. But what Danegold really taught the Vikings was that England was, and willing to pay. So they kept coming back, demanding more, and more, and more. But everything was about to change, because in 865, the Vikings stopped raiding and started conquering. Remember those seasonal raids? That's about to change forever. Long ships filling the horizon. 865, Anno Domini. The year everything changed. That autumn, the largest Viking force Britain had ever seen landed on the coast of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army. What even bring themselves to estimate its size? Normal, increasing to fast. This wasn't a raiding party of a few dozen ships. This was an army. Thousands of warriors, hundreds of ships, horses, supply trains, siege equipment. This was organized, professional, strategic, and it was led by legends. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a name that would echo through Viking legend for centuries. Ivar, called the Boneless, though no one knows exactly why. Some say he had a physical disability, others that he was unusually flexible in battle, still others that the name referred to his cunning rather than his body. Halfdan, a warrior so fierce that even other Vikings feared him. And Ubba, the strategist, the planner. Together, they commanded what may have been the most formidable military force in 9th century Europe. The Great Heathen Army represents a fundamental shift in Viking activity. This isn't seasonal raiding anymore. This is settlement. This is the intentional dismantling of Anglo-Saxon England. They had clear strategic objectives. They moved with purpose. They picked their targets carefully. They exploited political divisions between the English kingdoms brilliantly. And most importantly, they didn't just take treasure and leave. They took land. They were here to stay. The Great Heathen Army spent the winter of 865 to 866 in East Anglia. The local king, Edmund, had no choice but to provide them with horses and supplies. He was buying time, hoping they'd leave in the spring like raiders always did. They didn't leave. Instead, in November 866, they struck north. York, or as the Vikings would call it, Jorvik. The capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria, one of the great cities of Anglo-Saxon England, home to thousands, protected by Roman walls built 700 years earlier. The Vikings took it in a day. The fall of York was catastrophic. This wasn't some isolated monastery on an island. This was a capital city, a center of power, trade, and culture. The Northumbrian kingdom tried to retake it the following year. Both rival kings, Northumbria was in the midst of a civil war, put aside their differences and united against the Vikings. Both were killed in the attempt. Northumbria, as an independent kingdom, ceased to exist. Over the next 5 years, the Great Heathen Army systematically destroyed Anglo-Saxon England. 869. They conquered Mercia, the powerful Midlands kingdom, divided it among Viking warlords. 870. They returned to East Anglia. King Edmund, who had tried to buy them off 5 years earlier, was captured. According to legend, the Vikings offered to spare his life if he would renounce Christianity and share power with them. He refused. They tied him to a tree and shot him full of arrows, then beheaded him. The church would later canonize him as Saint Edmund, king and martyr. By 870, 3 of England's 4 great kingdoms had fallen: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia. All conquered, all under Viking control. Only English kingdom remained: Wessex. And Wessex had a new king, a young man who had already fought the Vikings in 9 separate battles, who had watched 3 of his older brothers die, 2 of them killed by Vikings. His name was Alfred. He was 22 years old, and he was England's last hope. Could one young king stop an army that had already destroyed 3 kingdoms? The odds say no, but Alfred was about to prove he was no ordinary king. Remember how we asked if Alfred could save England? First, he has to survive his own death sentence. January 878. Somewhere in the marshes of Somerset, a king was hiding like a fugitive. Alfred, King of Wessex, last hope of England, was reduced to a handful of followers, living in the swamps, hunted, defeated, seemingly finished. What happened? Twelfth night, January 6th, 878, the Christmas season, a time of truce and celebration in Christian Europe. The Viking leader Guthrum didn't care about Christian holidays. He launched a surprise attack on Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham in the middle of winter, during what should have been a sacred peace. Alfred barely escaped with his life. This is Alfred's absolute lowest point. The King of Wessex, the last English kingdom, is a fugitive hiding in the marshes with maybe a few dozen loyal followers. His kingdom has fallen. His army is scattered. Most of his nobles have either fled or submitted to the Vikings. By any rational measure, it's over. England has lost. There's a famous legend from this period, probably not literally true, but it captures the moment beautifully. Alfred takes shelter with a peasant woman who doesn't recognize him. She asks him to watch some cakes baking by the fire. But Alfred is so preoccupied, so overwhelmed by the catastrophe that's befallen his kingdom, that he lets the cakes burn. And this peasant woman scolds the King of England for not paying attention to his chores. It's probably fiction, but it's fiction. It shows how far Alfred had fallen, the mighty king reduced to this. But here's what's remarkable about Alfred. He didn't give up. From his base in the Somerset marshes, possibly at a place called Athelney, Alfred began to rebuild. He sent secret messages to his scattered followers. The king lives, the fight continues, be ready. He gathered intelligence on Viking positions and movements, planned, prepared, waited for his moment. And in May, after 4 months of hiding, Alfred emerged from the marshes. Building, he called the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, to assemble at a place called Egbert's Stone. And they came. From across Somerset, from Wiltshire, from Hampshire, men came. Farmers, craftsmen, minor nobles, anyone who could carry a weapon. They came to fight for their king, for their homes, for England. What's absolutely remarkable is that they came at all. Alfred had been defeated. His kingdom was occupied. Most of his nobles were dead or in hiding. But the men of Wessex still believed in him, still thought he could win. That tells you something profound about Alfred's character, about his leadership, about the loyalty he inspired. He fought against the entire army and put it to flight. End quote. But behind those few words lies an entire day of brutal, desperate combat. Shield walls clashing, spears and swords, men fighting and dying in the mud. Both sides knowing this was it. Win or lose, everything. And Alfred won. Edington was decisive. Alfred didn't just win the battle, he routed the Vikings, completely broke their army, pursued them back to their fortress at Chippenham, and besieged them there for 2 weeks. This was the first time a Viking army of this size and sophistication had been comprehensively defeated in England. The first time someone had proven they could be beaten. Slow motion, strategic thinking. But here's where Alfred proves he's not just a warrior. He had the Viking army trapped, starving, desperate. He could have massacred them, executed their leaders, driven the survivors into the sea. Instead, he made. Why would a victorious king spare his enemies? The answer reveals Alfred's true genius. What Alfred did next would shape England for the next 1,000 years. But first you need to understand what he was up against. Remember we asked why Alfred spared the Vikings? Now you'll understand his master plan. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed in 878, one of the most consequential documents in English history. Here's what Alfred agreed to. England would be divided. Alfred would rule the south and west, Wessex and what remained of Mercia. Guthrum and his Vikings would control the north and east, everything from East Anglia up through York. This Viking-controlled region became known as the Danelaw, the area where Danish law applied. Now, I know what you're thinking. Alfred just half of England to the Vikings after defeating them? But Alfred understood something crucial. He couldn't drive them out completely. He didn't have the strength. His victory at Edington was decisive, but his army was exhausted. More Vikings could arrive from Scandinavia any time. What he could do was define boundaries, create a legal framework, and most importantly, he could buy time to prepare. But there was a condition, a brilliant condition. Guthrum had to convert to Christianity, and Alfred himself would stand as his godfather. Think about what this means. In medieval Christianity, being someone's godfather created a sacred bond almost as strong as blood. It made Alfred and Guthrum spiritual kin. Breaking this treaty wouldn't just be political betrayal, it would be sacrilege, a sin against God. This is Alfred's genius on full display. He's not just thinking militarily, he's thinking strategically, long-term. He can't expel the Vikings by force, so instead, he's going to absorb them, contain them in the Danelaw, bind them with treaties and sacred oaths, Christianize them, and gradually, over generations if necessary, integrate them into English society. It's not a plan for total victory in the next year or even the next decade. It's a plan for ultimate victory over a century. And remarkably, it worked. Map showing Danelaw territory. Modern place names appearing. Grimsby, Derby, Scunthorpe, Whitby. The Danelaw wasn't just a political arrangement, It became a cultural boundary. In the Danelaw, Viking customs dominated. Viking law, Viking language. Even today, more than 1,000 years later, you can see the legacy. Any English place name ending in by, Thorpe, Toft, or Thwaite is Norse. By means farm or settlement. Thorpe means village. These are Viking words that are still on our maps. Grimsby, Grim's Farm. Derby, Deer Farm. Scunthorpe, Skuma's village. These places were founded by Vikings or renamed by Viking settlers. But language wasn't the only thing the Vikings brought. Their entire way of life was about to reshape half of England. So what was life actually like in the Danelaw? What did it mean to live under Viking rule? Let's start with York, or as the Vikings called it, the capital of Viking England. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age York shows us a thriving city. We find Islamic coins from Baghdad, Byzantine silks, Frankish pottery, amber from the Baltic, soapstone from Norway. These weren't isolated raiders anymore. They were part of a vast trading network that stretched from Ireland to Constantinople. York was a cosmopolitan commercial hub. The streets of Viking York were packed with craftsmen, leatherworkers, blacksmiths, jewelers, woodcarvers, textile workers. We know this because archaeologists found their workshops, complete with tools, scraps, half-finished products, even, and this is going to sound gross, but it's archaeologically valuable, we found Viking toilets and analyzed what was in them. Viking poop tells us about Viking diet: fish, meat, grains, fruits, and evidence of intestinal parasites that tell us about hygiene and living conditions. I told you it was gross, but it's gross. Shift to social structure imagery. Hierarchy diagram. Different social classes. But Viking society wasn't just about trade and crafts. It had a structure, a hierarchy that was different from Anglo-Saxon England in important ways. At the top, the jarls, the earls, the nobility, men who controlled land and led warriors in battle. In the middle, the carls, free farmers and craftsmen, the backbone of society. These men owned their own land or ran their own businesses. They had legal rights and could participate in Viking assemblies. At the bottom, the thralls, slaves. We need to talk about this honestly. Slavery was fundamental to the Viking economy, and Britain was a major of slaves. When Vikings raided, they weren't just taking gold and silver. They were taking people. Slaves were incredibly valuable. They could be sold, put to work, used as trade goods. There were slave markets throughout the Viking world. Dublin was a major slave trading center. So was York. Slaves from Britain were sold as far away as Islamic Spain and the Middle East. The archaeological evidence is grim. Mass graves in Dorset showing evidence of execution, possibly Vikings killed in retaliation by the English. Chains and restraints found in Viking settlements, evidence of violence against children and women. The Viking Age was brutal for everyone. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all this violence and exploitation, the Vikings who settled in the Danelaw gradually began to change. Most Vikings in the Danelaw weren't warriors. They were farmers, trying to make a living, trying to raise their families. They married local English women or brought wives from Scandinavia. They had children who grew up speaking both Norse and English. They converted to Christianity, sometimes genuinely, sometimes for political convenience. Slowly, gradually, the two cultures began to. This mixing of cultures would have genetic consequences that we can still measure today. Stay with me, this gets fascinating. Remember Alfred's treaty gave him time to prepare? Now you'll see what he was preparing for. While the Danelaw developed its hybrid Anglo-Viking culture, Alfred was busy transforming Wessex. He didn't just survive the Vikings. He didn't just defeat them. He revealed English governance, English education, English identity. Alfred is the only English king ever called the Great by his contemporaries, not centuries later by historians, but by the people who actually knew him. Let me show you why. First, defense. Alfred created a system of fortified towns called burhs, strategically placed across Wessex so that no one was more than 20 miles, a day's march, from a place of refuge. These weren't just military forts. They were towns, centers of trade and administration. Many are still major cities today: Oxford, Winchester, Southampton, Wareham. Second, military reform. Alfred reorganized the fyrd so that half the men were always on duty while the other half worked their farms. This meant Wessex could maintain a standing defense year-round. He built ships, the beginnings of an English navy. Not as good as Viking ships, but enough to contest Viking control of the seas. Third, education. This is what Alfred might be most proud of. He was deeply learned himself, unusual for a medieval king, and he believed that learning was essential to good government. He imported scholars from across Europe. He established schools, and, this is remarkable, he personally translated important Latin texts into English so his nobles could read them. The King of England spent his evenings translating philosophy. Think about that. Alfred's greatest achievement might be promoted the idea of a unified English identity. Before Alfred, people thought of themselves as Mercians or Northumbrians or West Saxons. Alfred encouraged them to think of themselves as the English people. He was creating a nation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which Alfred commissioned, tells history from an explicitly English perspective. It's propaganda, certainly, but effective propaganda. It created a shared narrative, a shared memory, a shared identity. When Alfred died in 899, age 50, he left behind a kingdom that was militarily secure, administratively sophisticated, and culturally unified. But his work wasn't finished. That would fall to his children, and particularly to his remarkable daughter. Meet Ethelfled, a woman who led armies, built fortresses, and ruled a kingdom in her own right. The Vikings never saw her coming. After Alfred's death, his son Edward and daughter Ethelfled continued his mission to reconquer England from the Vikings. Edward became King of Wessex, but Ethelfled, through her marriage to the Mercian lord Ethelred, became Lady of the Mercians. And when her husband died in 911, she ruled Mercia in her own right. A woman, ruling a kingdom, leading armies, in the year 911. Dr. Gittos. Ethelfled is one of the most remarkable women of the early medieval period, of any medieval period. She commanded armies. She built fortifications, at least 10 fortified burhs that we know of. She negotiated treaties. She led military campaigns. Dr. Gittos. The Welsh kings submitted to her authority. The Vikings feared her. And she did all this while technically being subordinate to her brother Edward, though in practice she operated as an independent ruler. Together, Edward and Ethelfled pursued their father's vision systematically. Year by year, they pushed north into the Danelaw. 913. Ethelfled secures Tamworth and Stafford. 914. Edward takes Bedford. 917. They coordinate a massive, two-pronged offensive. Edward conquers East Anglia. Ethelfled secures Derby. By 918, they had pushed the Vikings back to York and a thin strip of Northumbria. The Danelaw was almost entirely reconquered. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't genocide. This wasn't ethnic cleansing. This was integration. Viking jarls were allowed to keep their lands if they swore loyalty to the English crown. Viking towns were brought under English administration, but kept their Viking character. The Danelaw was becoming English, but England was also becoming part Viking. And then came Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, Edward's son. In 927, he conquered York, expelled the last Viking king, and declared himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English. For the first time in history, England was united under a single ruler. Professor Lavelle, Athelstan's achievement cannot be overstated. Before him, England was just a geographical expression. After him, it was a kingdom, a political reality. And he did it by defeating, absorbing, and ultimately integrating the Vikings. The Danelaw was English, but England was also forever changed by the Vikings. It seemed like the Viking Age was over. England was united, the Danelaw was integrated, peace had been achieved. But the Vikings weren't done with England yet. Just when England thought it was safe, the Second Viking Age was about to begin. And this time, they were coming with kingdoms behind them. Remember how Athelstan united England? It wouldn't last. For nearly 70 years after Athelstan, England enjoyed relative peace. The Vikings had been absorbed. The Danelaw was English. The threat seemed over. Then, in 980, Viking ships appeared on the English coast once more. But this time, they weren't scattered raiders. They were coming from newly unified, newly powerful kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, Sweden. This was the Second Viking Age, and it would end with a Viking on the throne of England. England's response? Pay them off. In 991, after a Viking victory at the Battle of Malden, England paid 10,000 pounds of silver, a fortune. The Vikings took the money and came back for more, again and again and again. England's king was Athelred II, later called the Unready, which actually means badly advised. And in 1002, he made the worst decision of his reign. The St. Brice's Day Massacre, November 13th, 1002. Athelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England. It was impossible to enforce and morally indefensible, but in some places it was carried out. Among the victims, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. What had been opportunistic raiding became a war of revenge. For the next 11 years, Sweyn systematically conquered England. In 1013, the English nobility surrendered. Athelred fled to Normandy. After 2 centuries of struggle, England had a Viking king. But Sweyn died just 5 weeks later. His son Cnut claimed the throne. Athelred returned. Civil war erupted. When the dust settled in 1016, Cnut was king of England, and he would prove to be one of its greatest rulers. Cnut the Viking conqueror would become Cnut the Great, loved by English and Danes alike. How? Cnut didn't rule England as a conqueror. He ruled it as a king. He married Emma of Normandy, Athelred's widow. He kept English laws and customs. He promoted English nobles. He lavished gifts on English churches. And he built an empire. England, Denmark, Norway, the entire North Sea under one crown. For nearly 20 years, this Anglo-Scandinavian empire brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. But when Cnut died in 1035, his empire died with him. His sons couldn't hold it together. By 1042, the English invited Edward, son of Ethelred, to take the throne. The Danish dynasty was over. England was English again. until 1066. January 1066, Edward the Confessor died childless. 3 men claimed England's throne: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl; Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, the last great Viking warrior; and William of Normandy. Wait, Normandy? What do the Normans have to do with Vikings? Everything. The Normans were Vikings, descended from Norse raiders who'd settled in northern France in 911. They spoke French and followed French customs, but they hadn't forgotten how to conquer. So 1066 wasn't just a succession crisis, it was happening simultaneously. September 25th, 1066, Stamford Bridge. Harold Godwinson crushed Harold Hardrada's Norwegian army. The last great Viking invasion was defeated. The Viking Age was over. Except it wasn't. Because 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on England's south coast. Harold force-marched his exhausted army 200 miles south. On October 14th at Hastings, the armies met. By nightfall, Harold was dead. William had won. The Viking Age ended with Vikings, French-speaking, Christianized Vikings, ruling England. The conquest changed everything. New language, new aristocracy, new architecture. But underneath, the Viking legacy remained. Remember those place names from the Danelaw? They're just the beginning. Walk down any street in Britain today and you're surrounded by Vikings. You just don't realize it. The English language is filled with Old Norse: sister, law, take, give, want, they, them, their. These aren't Norman French words. They're not Latin. They're Viking. So fundamental to English that we don't even realize they're foreign. The jury system? Viking. Trial by peers? Viking influence. The presumption of innocence? Partly based on Viking legal traditions. And then there's DNA. Modern genetic studies show that millions of people in Britain, particularly in the north and east, the old Danelaw, carry Viking ancestry. The Vikings aren't ancient history. They're part of who we are, literally. But here's the most important legacy, and it's not what you think. So why does any of this matter? Why should we care about events that happened over 1,000 years ago? Because the Viking Age shows us something crucial about how societies respond to invasion, migration, and cultural change. The English could have tried to exterminate the Vikings. They tried once, the St. Brice's Day massacre, and it was a catastrophe. Instead, over centuries, they integrated them. Not through weakness, but through pragmatic statecraft. Alfred defeated them militarily, then made peace. His successors reconquered the Danelaw, but kept Viking settlers as subjects. By the time of Cnut, the distinction between English and Danish was becoming meaningless in many areas. The result was a richer, more complex, more resilient culture. The Viking Age is a case study in how different peoples can clash, struggle, suffer, and ultimately create something greater than what came before. British identity has always been mixed, always been changing, always been absorbing new influences. That's not a weakness. That's its strength. From that first raid on Lindisfarne to this moment, we complete the circle. This slow, reverence, wonder. The Rhone ships are gone. The raiders won't return. The great battles have been fought and won and lost and fought again. But the Vikings never really left. They're in our words, in our laws, in our very DNA. Every time we speak English, we speak their language. Every time we value justice and rule of law, we honor their traditions. Every time we embrace change and diversity, we follow their example. From 793 to 1066, 273 years, the Vikings transformed Britain. They came as invaders. They stayed as settlers. They became British. Their story is our story. A story of conflict and cooperation, of destruction and creation, of how different peoples can clash and blend and ultimately forge something greater than what came before. The Viking Age, 793 to 1066. The blood of the Vikings flows still. Their legacy lives in us.